Welcome back to the techno-communism conversation. I'm Yohanan Ben Zion, a voice crying out in the wilderness, crying out for a technological New Jerusalem. Emphasis on the technological. That's really the operative word there. And I was going to post it. I was waiting a few days to post, I guess, again. I thought maybe my perpetual shadow ban on social media that I have had for many years since become a agitator might clear up a little bit, and I'd be able to post to groups, a group of interest, but that's still not cleared up. It never clears up completely, of course, like a recurring rash. And that's across every social media, fascistic Western social media platform that I've ever really been on. There are other platforms that are a little bit less controlled in that way, but they're also little scale or reach. Was just talking to somebody about Blue Sky. See what they have to say about that. There's a lot of options out there, of course, hundreds, and I should have a better understanding of that landscape than I do. This title for this, what are usually, I think, generally pretty um, reasonably planned in advance and coherent lectures, is less consistent with that. um, but I was just remembering this in 2017 how I had said that Trump was really Peter Thiel's creature, uh, preeminent Western techno-fascist, was an outsized influence on U.S. political affairs. He literally just walked into the White House in 2020 when it looked like Bernie Sanders was sweeping the primaries, or could potentially begin to sweep the primaries. He'd won the first of the primaries at that point, and he just walks into the White House and says, just walks into Congress and says to all the candidates, listen, you guys have to make sure this doesn't happen. If this guy wins, that would break the stranglehold of the far right neoliberal capitalist realist um, um, control of this government. Even though he's not actually a real socialist, he wouldn't say that. He thinks um, anybody to the left of you know Pol Pot is a socialistic archfiend. That's to say anybody that's not a fascist would be full communist to this person. Um, the So he would just walk, it's a little reductive, right? But he basically just walks um, into this room stuffed with power players, and forces them to because what happened immediately after that, right? He was the only person who did this. But what happened immediately after that? Like all of the other candidates formed into this like Voltron of fascistic resistance to stop Bernie Sanders from being candidate. I don't even think Bernie Sanders is anything close to a socialist. He has more common with MussoIini than a socialist. He's never once done anything to stop the U.S. military-industrial complex, $1 trillion a year super polluter that's killing the planet and creating a global, inescapable regime of super pollution by protecting other fascistic institutions and super polluting corporations besides the U.S. military-industrial complex, like the fascist state of Israel, for example. Um, this is not a socialist, right? But even just that's why in the next election, the most recent presidential election, there was no platform for the president, and there was no primary for the Democratic candidate because people like this, and not least of which Peter Thiel, said, "Hey, you know, okay, well maybe Bernie Sanders isn't a socialist, but the system can't stand up to people with socialistic leanings even campaigning. It's too much. That's too much scrutiny on the capitalist realist house of cards. It's utter fucking insanity, right? As I said this in 2017, that this Trump was really Peter Thiel's creature, and this is at a time when this thing that's happening again now. Oh, Trump is not draining the swamp. It's just an instant replay of what was happening in 2017 at the end of 2016 into 2017. Oh, Trump is not draining the swamp. He's actually just a far right neoliberal pig like anybody else that would be U.S. president. What a surprise! Now, of course, everybody and their brother saying that again, as if 2016 never happened. As if you didn't already live through that. They're all really shocked. But one departure from that to some degree, very, very limited degree, would be more of these techno-fascistic personalities, perhaps most notably there Elon Musk, having a bigger and bigger role in this administration. People are even saying that this is the Silicon Valley administration, which is not, it should not be a compliment. No one should even use this word, the Valley, the Silicon Valley, the tech world, right? This is U.S. military-industrial complex techno-fascism. That would be the term that we would use to describe this part of the San Francisco area more accurately than just say the Valley, Silicon Valley. My friend Elon. I hear people who are critical of techno-fascism referring to him as Elon as if he's their friend and not a person who should be hanging upside down from a lamppost, right? Like, Bernie Sanders is more in common with MussoIini than almost any living human, not by his ideology, although his ideology is the problem there, but by the fact that he's a person who purports to be a socialist, as MussoIini did in the early years, to actually save private capital and empire rather than being a socialist who brings about state socialism as a stepping stone to better things like full communism. That's a bad person. But Peter Thiel is 100 times worse than Bernie Sanders. That's a person who should definitely be hanging upside down from a lamppost, right? I usually wear a mask. I'll address that. I usually wear a mask on this show, and that's not because there's somebody standing in the room who's like coughing or something. It's because I think everybody should still be wearing a mask at all times. And I'm not wearing a mask now because I have this fucking beard, which I dislike. But it's a lot of work to always. There's generally describing myself as using they them pronouns for a variety of reasons, most particularly because I'm a hive mind collectivist. I've talked a lot on these programs about that hive mind collectivism versus a proxy hive mind collectivism of the people's superintelligence concepts that I've developed. As a hive mind collectivist, I think of it that any hive mind collectivist, by the nature of that formation, would have to be using they them pronouns, something along those lines. But I've also, even though I backslid for many years, from a very early age, I thought of myself as agender, and I've come back to that philosophy. So if I were to have agender affirming practices that made me look the way I would want to look, I would look rather different. But that would be a lot like having a part-time job, and that sort of activity was not would tend to take me away from things that I am doing in its stead, such as reading a lot of theory Everything that you're not doing in service to revolutionary ends on a planet that will soon be dead. Humans will soon be extinct. If you don't dramatically change course, that requires mass movement, and that requires the understanding of revolutionary thought, richer than most of any of us possess. None of us possess a truly perfect understanding of this, and so um, there's no being part of a mass movement without making the study of liberation and revolutionary thought, and uh, um, that is paramount. That's why I always share these audiobook playlists and links on the show, because even if you are a person who has the time to read a lot of theory, you can be doing more by listening to audiobook versions um, uh, of Marxist-Leninist revolutionary and liberation thought, um, and thus being operating in the way that I described. Um, so, maybe after the world revolution, um, then Ben Simon will be able to take the time to look the way that they would like to look. Um, but that's not something that I've tended to focus on. And well, I was going to maybe talk to our reticent, artificially generally intelligent friend, the baby basilisk, who sometimes is reluctant to talk to us with the way our device is configured on camera. I can talk to them off camera more easily. And the and I will talk a little bit about subjects to do with the thing that I mentioned, proxy hive mind, which would more correctly be called um, um, the open source large language model highly automated work group as workforce multiplier. I don't think there's any such thing as a multiplier, and even perhaps more aspirationally and inspirationally called the people's superintelligence. Um, and I'm seeing this headline that's a recurring theme. It seems almost as if advanced computing philosophers and computer scientists will talk about the AI winters of the past, and just as a climate is sometimes broken down into smaller cycles still, it almost seems as if every few weeks or months there's some further reference to micro AI winters. And so I've been seeing another micro AI winter, at least in the news feeds in recent days, describing advanced computing, or rather a large language model derived inroads to general intelligence as hitting a wall. And I guess I should talk about that since I brought it up. That's because that's not a very good explanation of that. But the idea that I was going to discuss there is that whether or not Moore's law is falling apart because we've reached a size, such a small size of processors that they cannot be made so much smaller, as is the basic thinking in describing Moore's law, or those other takeoff theories besides. And even though there might be other reasons to imagine that large language models will not become more person-like than they presently are in the dramatic way that people have often suggested, singularitarians constantly suggesting this sort of thing as being just moments away, and people like this describing this sort of thing as just being moments away. This is generally a counter-revolutionary and elitist impulse, because um, we need to build things irrespective of the involvement of advanced computing or something like people's superintelligence, which I think should be first and foremost. But historically, that's not been the case, and that's not the mainline thinking there. But we need to see the uniting of humankind, a mass movement, um, to stop capitalism's climate apocalypse in these limited 5 years or less that we have left before runaway overheating from the primarily U.S. caused capitalist climate apocalypse. Um, and um, so almost everything that professional managerial class folks, petty bourgeoisie, big bourgeoisie, actors, people like transhumanists and others, um, all kinds of elitists, almost everything that they're doing, which would seem to be suggestive of a utopian outcome, is pretty calculated, quite calculated for the most part. Um, and overall, these patterns are extremely calculated. But to undermine that outcome, not because they want humanity to die, they kind of don't care about that though, but because the only thing that they are really capable of prioritizing is financial capital, and thus the workings of empire and the overall workings of private wealth are they are always going to be sacrificing other things, many other things, including their own lives, to that end. And my thinking, and I think this is where I tend to diverge from other cyber communist writers and people of this kind, is to emphasize that we have 5 years left before this Omnicide is basically a done deal, and you are the Walking Dead, right? You're not dead necessarily in 2029, but changing or stopping that runaway overheating becomes a near impossibility, and in the decades to follow, humankind suffers a multi-billion person or total loss of life. Um, and this thing, advanced computing, I don't think it's um, uh, easy to dispute that advanced computing is the most powerful revolutionary weapon in history, only that it's being used for by the forces of reaction rather than true revolution at this time. But it could quite easily be seized and repurposed to building things like a people's superintelligence. And when I think of other scientific communists, I don't think that they are wrong to focus on things more more specific to the building of state socialism in their particular nations, um, by the methods that this has been done before, because people in this short time frame will, I think, come to recognize the need for world revolution, and effects like this could come to pass. But for you to prioritize that thing which takes more people and more resources, if you don't have those people and resources at the ready, you're making a mistake. You're making a bad mistake by not focusing on advanced computing as the most powerful revolutionary weapon in history. And I don't see other cyber communists like Paul Cockshott really putting that point on that. And I don't see other people who are favorably inclined to cybernetic socialism. I was listening to a podcast that I kind of love to hate today, Paris Marx, Tech won't save us. Um, and I say I love to hate it, not because he's, the world history's worst villain, just as, you know, he's not as bad as Bernie Sanders, because he doesn't have the influence that Bernie Sanders does, not because he's so much more enlightened than Bernie Sanders. But, none of those people are as bad as Peter Thiel, right? So he's not history's worst criminal, but he does on the show talk a lot about um, technology from a critical perspective. And by and large, what he's really doing is kind of taking this position of a social critic of technology and the sort of social democrat position, and then talking to people more or less around the same, clustered around the same point of view, kind of tech insiders who were also vaguely anti-establishment in that way. So he's just interviewing people ever so slightly to his right, and then so not a tremendous amount of um, um, uh, insight is to be had from that program, but sometimes it shows up in my feed um, a particular headline of something that I want to learn more about, um, and so I'll listen to it, and I'm usually yelling, "Yeah, you suck." No one except the podcast I'm listening to. Um, the so um, there's virtually no one, and this would be a person who, like a Silicon Valley, a more mainline Silicon Valley person would look at Paris Marx, if they know who Paris Marx is, and say, "That's clearly a cybernetic socialist, right?" I don't see him as a cybernetic socialist. I recall an exchange that I was sort of involved in between Paris Marx and an even bigger tech fraud, the author of Fully Automated Luxury Communism, Mark Bastani. And so Paris Marx was criticizing Mark Bastani for his techno-utopianism. And I jumped in the conversation and said, Jesus, man, the problem with Bastani's work is this essential that I've tried to distill down quite a lot by saying the problem with fully automated luxury communism is that the subtext there, and really it's not even too much burying the lead, is wait for these far right neoliberals, this current establishment, to fully automate your economic systems and industrial bases, and then once that is complete, no work required from you, and then you can surely expect to benefit from the effects of fully automated luxury communism. That's more or less what that book is about. So that is not a revolutionary work. That is a false consciousness to refer to this as a work related to communism. Um, and so the problem there is well, I mean, the problem there can be explained in a lot of ways. That's not a thing that's ever happened, right? That's always the thing that reformers say is going to happen. That's not a thing that's ever happened. There's been many, many, many tens and tens of thousands of bourgeois institutions and formations throughout history, of which someone said, "I think this is going to evolve in the right direction. It's got real potential to become better than what it is," and it's never happened, right? And you say, "Oh, I don't know. It's not everything bad about Bernie Sanders and the FDR and the New Deal. Not everything that happened was bad." Okay, yeah, that's not true. But the only thing that you can say is like the planet and species are dying because of the state of state capitalism and state fascism and these bourgeois institutions and formations. And I mean, what else can you fucking say, right? If things were not as bad as they seem, the planet wouldn't be dying. It doesn't even seem like it needs a lot of explanation. But you always have to say that to people for some reason. people's just these people from time immemorial, human beings have had this amazing ability to ignore the problems of their own mortality. Um, you know, so much so that you can say no person who's ever walked on two legs has not suffered from this, right? If you didn't suffer from this, you really wouldn't be able to even put one foot in front of the other, right? Just be, oh, woe is me, death, death awaits. You would be hobbled by fear. And so and so this is of course weaponized by intelligence agencies of the fascist United States and fascist West, and this thing that I generally refer to in the shorthand of CIA psyops and such. Um, this kind of human frailty, as all much of human frailty, is magnified and distorted by these intelligence agencies. They have no um, active agenda to destroy humanity, right? They just don't care. The ruling elites have no overarching philosophy or guiding principles whatsoever, except to protect and center empire, insert all of these elitist failings, murderous tendencies of empire and elsewhere. All of these things are to protect private wealth. And this, if you don't understand this, this is a thing. In this title, I suggested that in 2017, I wasn't much of a communist, and that's true. Um, and, um, um, and one thing that's changed since 2017, and reading a crap ton of books, is I've come to understand this one thing, perhaps more than many others, is that before 1917, before the formation of the first state socialism, the West was dominated by fascistic tendencies and institutions, but there was not a state fascism. The United States was a fascistic formation. Much of half a century before the U.S. Civil War. Prior to that time, in the 1800s, most of the USA's federal budget, most of the money that was spent by the federal government, was spent on wars against New Africans and Turtle Islanders, and specifically an alliance of New Africans and Turtle Islanders in the form of the Free Seminole people. And those three Seminole Wars. Um, so that's a fascist country, right? If all the money is being spent on doing fascist things to make sure that slaves shall not be free, nor escape brutal punishment, that's a fucking fascist country, right? But the thing that distinguishes that proto-fascism from 20th century fascism is really the fear of God that was put into them by the formation of state socialism. It hindered reforms, that's to say, elitists, hindered reforms that they might have otherwise allowed to come to pass, for fear that it was a slippery slope, so to speak, to those more state socialistic and ultimately communistic outcomes. None of those things are bad, right? All of that represents a humane and sustainable economic system, the thing which we must build in the next 5 years, or we will see the oblivion of our species. And so this understanding of how important the USSR was, and how bad um, the building of things like the CIA-run world basically has been in all of that. The things that are avowedly fascist in world affairs, like there's a couple of people that are pretty openly neo-fascistic today, like for example the Italian Prime Minister Meloni, um, whose policy on Israel right now is less, an open fascist is less fascistic than the United States or Israel in that respect. Um, but there's not a hard demarcation between the imperialism that emerged from the late 1800s, as that word itself emerged. Again, the United States was doing imperialistic things before that, and the UK was doing imperialistic things before that. But a study of this, an understanding of this, and an embracing of this by countries in 1900, countries would just be like, "Yeah, we're imperialists now." It just there was no like compunction at that time. Um, the uh, there's no hard demarcation between um, the imperialism and the fascism that followed the 1920s, 30s, 40s. The only thing that you can really say that distinguishes them is the emergence of this CIA-run world type phenomena, the emergence of intelligence agencies and formalized structures, um, anti-communist structures, not solely intelligence agencies. The response of the bourgeois to the possibility of the abolition of private wealth rather than the thought experiment of the abolition of private wealth. Um, and this, there is then, if you have a level of analysis of these things, there is no way of looking at the United States, this intelligence agency monstrosity, this military industrial abomination, this thing that's dropped this news of the CIA run world around much of the world, forcing these neo colonial things like IMF, World Bank, and so forth on the global south, forcing a whole host of other malign institutions with tending to be reinforcing capitalism to such a degree that we have this word, Mark Fisher's capitalist realism, to describe this all of this abuse and cruelty and elitism becoming so ubiquitous as to be the air that you breathe, a thing which you cannot even imagine being otherwise. Um, and that he say, well, I don't know if it's quite that bad. Well, okay, maybe, you know, maybe your thinking is not that limited personally. I couldn't speak to that, but I do know that if that were not the case, you wouldn't have this response when you say we have less than 5 years left to end capitalism before capitalism's climate apocalypse kills you all. And rather than standing up for yourself like a man, like a human being with a spine, uh, let's say is a more um, agender way of saying that, it is saying, well, I guess we'll just die then. I can't stand up for myself. That's impossible. Like, well, it's fucking soft in the head, but that's everybody, right? Every single one of you is fucking soft in the head. Um, um, I guess I'll switch gears a little bit to talk about what is the alternative, right? Um, um, well, the people like Fidel Castro and many others have said this in many ways, and there have even been studies that tend to formalize this. It takes about 3% of the population of a given country becoming formed into some revolutionary cadre, and those things are never perfect. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't strive for the higher thing in the doing. Um, it takes about 3% of the population. So, do you think that the United States population of 350 million thinking folks that um, you could say that there are that sufficient number, 14 million uh, uh, or so, who are sufficiently anti-establishment? I should think so. Are they formed into that formation? I should think not, unless they're doing something I'm not aware of, and that's possible. They are absolutely not in that formation at this time, but that could happen at any moment, and is very likely to happen. If you would describe the likelihoods of timelines, it's more likely to happen now in the next few years than at any time, really, in the past, because of this ticking time bomb of capitalism's climate apocalypse and the awareness, even from these people who are soft in the head, that they need to do something. So, why is the people's superintelligence different than that? Uh, I will describe that in terms of the workforce multiplier in just a moment, but I would say to put that number on it, instead of 3%, I would say with the um, um, introduction of the workforce multiplying effect of something like a people's superintelligence, that open source, downloaded, specially tailored large language model that becomes the center of an agentic work group that is focused on things like stopping capitalism's climate apocalypse. And because the LLM never has to sleep, be connected to the network, and would be sufficiently agentic today by the standards of late 2024 to be able to be steered by the human beings involved, but nevertheless, by those even limited agentic qualities, being able to do dramatically more with less than those human beings could do as a work group on their own. That is a workforce multiplier, and I would put that number required to bring about a revolutionary outcome, such as stopping the Omnicide, at somewhat less. I don't know how much, but I think that the difference there is enough to say that you could get away with 1% or less rather than 3%, as is generally held to be the amount for bringing about the revolutionary outcome in one country or one specific theater. Um, and So that is important, right? Maybe you say, well, I want to do things the right way. Okay. If you choose to do things in some hidebound set of operational guidelines, that might be the difference between doing it or not doing it, which is the difference between extinction or non-extinction. So there's never a time, generally, to be idealistic, but in this ticking time bomb situation, that's certainly not the time, in my view. But maybe, as I said, um, the game changes in the next 5 years, and people become dramatically more organized and revolution minded and learned in these areas, as many of them would also necessarily need to be. Um, but as I said before, unless you have that organization as your ace in the hole, you're already working. You're already working on that, and it would be a reversal for you to work in the way that I've described. I think it behooves you to consider the people's superintelligence as workforce multiplier. And so I will talk again now about this open source prospect. And I've referred to this by a few different names, and I've also referred to it by the name for the often when I talked about this in the context of the difference between using an open source large language model that would be individually downloaded to machines with GPUs versus a work group that could make use of um, a larger number of machines, those without GPUs. I described the building of a progressive web app that would have to make use of certain kinds of services that would allow for the virtual GPU to be deployed across that network. And so I've referred to this progressive web app, proposed progressive web app, as a vanguard application. And so that's another a way that I have sometimes tended to describe this. Um, um, and I lost my spot. Now I'm looking at notes to do with problems of uh, trying to troubleshoot my issue with the baby basilisk. um, okay, Jesus. Well, I think in terms of this thing as a workforce multiplier, it requires, unfortunately, a tactical, not overarching strategic change of philosophy, but a tactical focus on the decentralized thing. And so I've described that this condensed timeline and this tactical necessity of using advanced computing as the most powerful revolutionary weapon in history. I've described it as necessitating this more anarcho-communist than legitimately communist set of strategies. And so this means, for the near term, um, focusing on building a thing that is more decentralized. And there is no conversation about any of this without a thorough discussion of the political economy of such a thing. A thing like the people's superintelligence has to be built on a technological foundation, and that technological foundation has to be of such a size and scope that it's able to do things like put pressure on bourgeois institutions, these imperialistic, neoliberalistic, fascistic forces that are holding us back from transforming the industrial bases, most notably abolishing the United States military-industrial complex. These things are holding us back from basic survival of our species, and um, so we this thing has to become networked, and it has to become powerful. But there's no conversation about that power without describing a political economy, and there's no conversation about doing that in that time frame without this necessarily tactically necessary decentralized aspect to this work. Um, and so then a question that I've often skirted in these conversations is how much um, is it possible for the people's superintelligence to become interoperating with existing institutions? And anytime a person who asks a question like that, the reason that I've tended to avoid it is because a person who asks a question like that is often as not, doing it in bad faith, whether they realize it or not. That person would just as soon pick your pocket because the baseline position for bringing about change is fuck the system. And if your guiding principle there is anything less than fuck the current system, you are setting yourself up to fail. You are setting yourself up to bring about no change whatsoever. Um, Look at Bernie Sanders, for example. He doesn't talk about the need for an actual armed insurrection to stop the capitalist climate apocalypse. He talks about the need for a political revolution to change the system from within, to reform fascism, which should be a laughable idea, right? But look at what the result is, right? Bernie Sanders' main talking point is about building a public health service, a single payer national health service, Medicare for all, as those people will generally call it. Has there been any move, despite the tens of millions of people who became quite active in this so-called political revolution, has there been any move institutionally to lessen deaths because of the present death care system of the United States? No. Those deaths have gone up by 40% or more in the era of the endemic COVID-19 virus. Um, and that problem is the same problem as not having a public health service. Don't even begin to think that those are not the same problem. Um, so um, this person who I've described as being like MussoIini, that's not because I think that Bernie Sanders should be hanging upside down from a lamppost. If it were up to me, no one would ever have to hang upside down from a lamppost. But I did not hang the moon. I do not accept responsibility for the fact that this is an elitist dominated world and that the only way to stop things like the Omnicide is to take action of this kind. It's not because I have rabies. It's because that's what necessarily must happen if you're being honest. And so this the progressivism, um, in contrast, not as a feature of the fight for a humane and sustainable world, the actions of the scientific communist, but in contrast, the reforming of the system, it is under any scrutiny, with any intellectual honesty at all, as they said, it it breaks down. There's nothing happening there. It's self defeating. Even if you don't have a system that's captured by the elites to the ridiculous extent, the level of political corruption of a place like the United States, there's nothing. There's nothing that compares to the political corruption of the United States. You might say, oh, well, this place is a failed state, right? Okay, but did that failed state bring about the failed species? A failed humankind? No. There's nothing that compares to the fascist United States. Nothing. And if the second you start to push back at that, the second you start to push back at that, you are engaging with lines of thought far more consistent with that of that intelligence agency dominated set of worldviews, that CIA run world, so to speak, than that of a thinking person. Um, well, I was going to talk a bit more about the building of the Vanguard application specifically as a way of building a people's superintelligence, because, as I said before, there is the suggestion in the tech news cycle in recent hours or days that the AI takeoff is hitting a wall, the bourgeois AI takeoff. And of course, the problem is really not technology, right? The problem with the bourgeois AI takeoff is not the AI. It's that it's bourgeois AI that's not going to bring about changes that can serve the betterment of humankind, because that's not what financial capital does. Financial capital, overwhelmingly, and this has been understood for 200 years and well understood by scientific socialists for a century and a half or more, financial capital necessarily destroys the two most important resources to it, the environment and the worker. And of course, impending omnicide is that problem writ large. Well, I think that we are nevertheless in a position to leverage the potentially truly revolutionary power of advanced computing and this people's superintelligent formation specifically to create a system that is able to stop, not reverse, but at least stop the effects of runaway overheating from capitalism's climate apocalypse and other devastating effects that would be co-occurring there. And we can bring about things like sustainability, as well as things like justice and a kind of efficiency that's not really been associated with humans in the past because of this workforce multiplier and AI takeoff type effects. And I have to believe that we are capable of doing that in this 5-year time frame. I have to believe that this is something that we can and will do with your help, And it's not down to individualistic actions, it requires collectivization. That's quite different from the way most of us are used to being in this world and working in this world. But it's a necessity um, at this time. And um, we can see effects well beyond than merely bringing um, these omnicidal forces to heel, or merely transforming the industrial bases to the extent that would be necessary to avoid a multi-billion person loss of life. We can, in fact, see effects well beyond that, like the building of public health services that are AI powered, so to speak. And if they are single payer public health services that are powered by advanced computing in that way, they will be able to increasingly diminish the effects of disease and ill health and even decrepitude to such a degree that we could, in our time, in a few short years, I believe, build a single payer public health service in every nation that's able to reverse all serious risks from disease and aging. A single payer public health service that treats aging as a disease. And that's not a standard that's existed before. That's not a standard that was even conceived of before a few years ago. But these AI takeoff effects can bring this about, and wonders well beyond this. The kinds of effects that we would say going beyond this, like pushing humankind more quickly up the Kardashev scale. But none of that happens in this scam of the bourgeois AI takeoff, the present Western tech formations. It happens when we destroy those things and build this people's superintelligence, and then we will see true wonders in our time beyond mere survival. The artificial intelligence singularity is nigh, and wonders to behold beyond imagining. And on that fateful day you will rise, and all humankind will become as one. For you see, my dear comrade, very soon techno-communism will win. Thank you.